Hi everyone. So as Alexia was saying, I'm Yajna Govind. I'm a PhD student at the Paris School of Economics and INED. And today I'll be speaking about my job market paper that looks at whether obtaining the nationality of the host country can help foreigners better integrate the labor market, providing evidence for a quasi-experimental design. So I think this question is very important on many levels, one of which is the political debate, the political aspect of it. So let me start by giving you two statements from the French press that gives us an idea of how this question is, where it's situated in the political debate. So the first statement here gives you an idea that naturalization is becoming harder and harder. Today, to be naturalized, you have to prove that you're already integrated to obtain the nationality. The second statement gives us an idea of the position of the different political parties. This is a statement by the right-wing party in France that criticizes the Socialist Party in 2013 by saying that they want to increase the number of naturalization to facilitate the integration of immigrants. On the contrary, they think that becoming French must be the result of a successful journey of assimilation into the French community. So this gives us, to simplify, two main positions around the question. One is to say that naturalization can be a tool for integration, in which case you would want to ease the access to citizenship, or at least give it at a relatively earlier stage in the integration process. The second position is to say that naturalization is only a reward for integration, in which case you would want it to come at the end of the integration process and to harden the path to citizenship. What I will look at in this paper is to assess whether naturalization, beyond being a reward for integration, whether it can in itself help foreigners to better integrate the labor market, that is to say, whether it can be a tool for integration. Apart from the political debate, naturalization is also, this question is also going to be important in general, given that it's going to be relevant for a significant share of the population. Around 12% of the total population in France and the US, for instance, are foreign born, of which around 40% are naturalized. Today, I'll be focusing on one of the aspects of integration. We know that integration can be in terms of political, cultural, social, and so on. And what I'm going to be looking at today is the economic integration. Of course, they're all very much interlinked between each other. So the economic integration of foreigners is going to be important and a desirable condition for the foreigners themselves, but also for the host country. So there are some evidences that show that foreigners that are very well integrated on the labor market tend to be self-sufficient, so they don't depend on the welfare state. They tend to have even positive net fiscal contributions. They tend to commit less crime. And so this whole question is going to be relevant also for the social cohesion in the host country. There are different factors that can help foreigners better integrate the labor market, whether it's in terms of acquisition of language skills, whether they're married to a national, or in terms of the network effect. However, despite all of these factors, migrants tend to remain at a disadvantage on the labor market when they're compared to natives, and this is often associated to a slow or incomplete integration of immigrants. So the question that I'm going to ask in this paper is to check whether naturalization can be a potential tool to boost labor market integration. And I will provide, as I will try to convince you throughout this presentation, causal evidence of the effect of naturalization on earnings. The context that I will be exploiting is to be exploiting a quasi-experimental design by exploiting a policy reform in France that happened in 2006 that basically hardened the access to naturalization through the marriage channel. In this paper, I'm going to be focusing on naturalization, given that in the context of France, this is the most important step in terms of the legal status of foreigners. But if you think about it, you can think about it in other terms in other countries. For instance, the US, Canada, and Australia, the equivalent step would be obtaining the permanent residence, for instance. So the data that I'll be using in this paper is administrative panel data, the échantillon démographique permanent, that will allow me to match information from the civil registry of marriage to the population census to the employee panel data. The empirical setting that I'll be using in this paper is to, basically the reform has impacted foreigners married to French national at different points in time. And I'm going to compare different cohorts of marriage of these foreigners and follow them over time. And I'll be comparing the labor market outcomes before and after the threshold date that I will explain in the design. The approach that I will use is a difference in difference and a triple difference with matching approach. So the different strands of the literature that I contribute with in this paper is, so first, the strand of the first, let's say, the pioneer strands of the literature that have found a positive correlation between naturalization and labor market outcomes. What most of these papers that I cited here have done is to compare naturalized citizens to non-naturalized foreigners. So this gives us a first insight, so the correlation, whether it's positive or negative, and in this case, it's a positive correlation. However, they're going to face issues such as double self-selection and the genital reverse causality. So you might imagine that among the pool of foreigners, there's going to be a selection of people who are going to apply for the nationality, and among those who apply for the nationality, there's going to be another selection of who ends up getting the nationality. So comparing those who ends up getting the nationality to the pool of foreigners is going to lead to biased estimates. We can also think that better labor market outcomes gives you better chances of obtaining the nationality, so you might be worried about issues of endogeneity and reverse causality. So with this paper, I'm going to be contributing to this strand of the literature by exploiting an exogenous shock to estimate the causal effect of naturalization, which brings me closer to a more recent and sparse strand of the literature that has used natural experiments to look at the question. Here I'm citing the one that I come closest to. The first paper by Muller and co-authors is a paper in Switzerland that compares, that follow people over time, those who follow individuals whose naturalization application was accepted versus those whose naturalization application was rejected by a very close margin. And they follow these individuals over time and find that there's a persistent positive effect in the very long run. What they do is to compare the positive versus the negative effect of being accepted or rejected. What I'll be able to do in my paper is instead to exploit a change in the access to naturalization to compare the positive effect of obtaining the nationality to the neutral effect, that is the group of people that will eventually obtain the nationality but has not yet obtained it. This brings me closer to the paper of Gadman and Keller that does something similar by exploiting a change in access to naturalization. What I'll be able to do with my paper is to identify the immediate and direct effect of naturalization. And very briefly, it also brings me closer to the literature on discrimination, where using testing, these papers have shown that language signals can be important when applying for jobs, or nationality seems to matter as well. In this paper by Duguay and co-authors, they show that showing a French nationality versus a Moroccan nationality gives you a higher success in terms of callback rates from employers. So with this paper, I'm going to provide suggestive evidence that nationality is used as a signal for better integration and helps reducing discrimination. So what I find in this paper, very briefly, is that naturalization leads to an increase in annual earnings by around 2,000 euros. So that this is annual earnings, which corresponds to around 25% increase in earnings. This is true for both men and women. And this is driven by an increase in both the number of hours worked, as well as an increase in long hourly wages, without any evidence that this has helped in terms of people moving from part-time to full-time employment. There are different channels and mechanisms that could come in play. I have not spent a lot of time on this, but we can come back into this in the discussion. Different reasons why we think that naturalization would have a positive effect. If you think of the fact that it gives you an unrestricted access on the labor market, it gives you a stable stay, it gives you the possibility to signal your willingness to stay and so on. And in the second part of the paper, I'm going to try to test some of the mechanisms, and I do not find any detectable effect of naturalization on public sector employment, which would be the first one you would imagine if you think of naturalization giving you an unrestricted access on the labor market. And what I find is that the younger and the manual workers and employees, that is those at the bottom of the distribution, tends to gain more. And the non-Francophone also tends to gain more than Francophones. which leads me to conclude that naturalization helps those who are the least integrated, is in fact a tool for labor market integration. So in this talk, I'm going to go through the context and the design to then briefly go over the data and the empirical setting, and finally show you the results of the analysis. So the context that I will be exploiting is one in France. France has a very long history of migration policy within its political debates, and one of which that comes often is the question about naturalization. So there are three main channels through which you can apply for the French nationality. The third one being those for children born to foreign parents. Since I'm going to focus on working age population, I'm not going to speak at all. I mean, this channel is not going to be relevant. So the two other channels that's going to matter, or you should keep in mind, is that there are two main channels for an adult, foreign adult to apply for the nationality. The first one is the one I'm going to call the general channel. So this is a channel where a foreigner who can prove extensive socioeconomic integration can apply for the French nationality. There's going to be some eligibility criteria in terms of the length of their stay in France, in terms of and mostly in terms of their professional integration. And the success rate on that is around 70%, which is normally a very low rate, given that only those who are eligible are going to apply for this channel of naturalization. The second channel of naturalization would be through marriage, and is the channel that I'm going to focus on in this presentation, which is basically the channel that any foreigner who is married to a French citizen can apply for the nationality to. So here, given that the marriage is going to be in itself considered as a proof of integration, the government or the authorities that are in charge of giving or not the nationality are going to mostly check the validity of the marriage. So they are going to do extensive checks of whether that marriage is valid. And one of the criteria that is one of the most important criteria to apply through this channel is going to be the length of marital life. So you have to spend a certain number of years since marriage to become eligible to apply for the nationality for that channel. So given that I'm going to be focusing on the naturalization channel for marriage, I'm by default going to be looking at mixed marriage. So these are marriages between foreigners and French citizens as defined by the nationality at the date of marriage. And this generally corresponds to around 13% of all marriages in France. So the fact that I'm going to be focusing on mixed marriages means that I'm going to be focusing on foreigners who are married to a French citizen, and we might imagine that these foreigners might be differently selected from the whole group of foreigners. So they will be likely to be more integrated. First, because through their marriage, they are going to obtain a long-run residence and work permit that will allow them to stay in France and work, have an authorization to work. What this means is that employers do not face an additional cost to employ these foreigners because they already have a permit to stay and work in France. They are also potentially have better language skills. They might also have network effects. They might have adopted the French family name of their spouse. And in the data, I see that there are slightly more francophone. That would be unsurprising. They're a little bit more educated, but still more employed at the bottom of the distribution and less at the top in the executive position. So in this paper, given the sample that I'm looking at, so given that this population is slightly more integrated than the main pool of foreigners, I'm going to show you that among this population, there's going to be like a random assignment to two different groups. And that will allow me to retrieve the causal effect of naturalization for this type of the population. So,
Yajna,
yeah.
may I interrupt short questions by Cem Özgüzel. So what do you do with marriages involving EU nationals?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in this stage of the analysis, I excluded all the European migrants with the idea that they are going to not have the same restrictions on the labor market as non-European. And so far, in all the results that I'm going to show you in today's presentation, is only going to concern the non-European, married to French citizens. Yeah. The reform that I'm going to be looking at is a reform that happens in 2006, whereby basically before 2006, the law of naturalization for marriage stated that a foreigner could apply after a period of 2 years from their date of marriage, could apply for the French nationality by declaration. I'm not going to focus on the second part of this law that also changed because I can't identify those people. So I want you to focus only on the fact that before 2006, you had to show 2 years of marriage to be eligible to apply for the French nationality by marriage. And after 2006, this this waiting period increased to 4 years. So now you had to have 4 years of marriage to be eligible to apply for the nationality. The features of this that's going to be important for my identification strategy is going to be the fact that the law that's going to matter is the law that is in place at the time of application. So whenever you're going to go and apply for the nationality, whatever law is in place is the one that's going to apply to your specific case, and that this was a largely unanticipated reform.
Yajna, may I interpret again? I have a question by Morgan Rowe on what is the share of naturalization that is obtained through the marriage channel? So just descriptive stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I'll just show you this very quickly. So around 20% of all marriages are through the marriage channel. Around 60% is through the general, what I call the general channel, and 20% is through children born to foreign parents in France. But this is the descriptive statistics. What I'm not going to be able to do is in the data, I won't be able to disentangle how are these people naturalized. So in the administrative data, there's not going to be any information on which channel they are choosing to apply for the nationality. So let me go through the design, and you can please stop me if there's anything not clear in the design. So if you think about it, so this is a reform that happens in July 2006. And if you look at the horizontal line as a timeline, and you think about it in terms of the date of application, anyone who would apply for the nationality before July 2006 would have to show that they've been married for 2 years, for at least 2 years. And anyone who would apply for the nationality after July 2006 would have to show that they have been married for at least 4 years of marriage. If I had the full information in terms of the date of application, the date of marriage, and the date they obtain their nationality, and the channel through which they apply for the nationality, I should have seen that those who are applying for marriage had at least 2 years since their marriage, and those who are applying for marriage after July 2006 had at least 4 years of marriage. However, in the data, there's a lot of information that I won't be having. So the date of application, the date of nationality, and the channel for which they apply for the nationality is not recorded. So what I will do is to proxy all these information. So the first proxy is that I'm going to proxy the date of applications through the date of marriage. So what this does is that it shifts the time, the threshold from July 2006 to July 2004. So basically, if you think about it in terms of the date of marriage, anyone who's married before July 2004 will be eligible. So thinking they would apply 2 years later will still be eligible to apply for the nationality 2 years after their marriage because the law has not passed yet. The reform has not passed yet. However, someone who's married after July 2004, thinking they would apply in 2 years, 2 years later, the reform has passed and now they need to wait 2 additional years. So more concretely, someone married in January 2000, in January 2006, the reform has not passed and they can apply, they're eligible. And someone who's married in January 2005, thinking they would apply in January 2007, 2 years later in January 2007, the reform has passed, now they have to show 2 additional years of marriage. So what I'm going to define in my setting as treated and control is treated are going to be those who are going to be who will have to wait a shorter period of time to be naturalized, and control are going to be those who have to wait a longer period of time to be naturalized. So you can just switch between treated and shorter, control and longer. And what I'm going to do is also trim my to make sure that no one has is contaminated by the reform. So in my control group, I'm going to trim so my sample is going to stop in February 2006, given that the reform was announced and discussed as from March 2006. So in my sample, there will be no one who has heard about the announcement or the discussion reform. And what I'm going to do is also trim in the treated group, because these are people those who marry very close to July 2004, 2 years later, it might be too close to the deadline to be able to apply for the nationality. So if you have not got the design completely, here is another way of thinking about it. So on the x-axis here, I have the years since marriage. So T0 is the year of marriage. T1, T2, T3 is every additional year since marriage. So that T8 is 8 years after marriage. If I assume that there's full compliance and that there's no administrative delay, in the sense that anyone who applies gets the nationality right away, what you would expect to see is that those who have to wait a shorter period of time, so those who are faced with the 2-year deadline, so the 2-year criteria, in other words, so if I have to rephrase it, none of the two groups are going to be eligible in the first 2 years since marriage. So in T0, T1, T2, none of the two groups are going to be naturalized. As from the second year of marriage, there's going to be one of the two groups, the one that has a shorter eligibility waiting period, that will be fully naturalized, while the control group is going to still be at 0 because they are not yet eligible. And 4 years after their marriage, they're also going to be eligible. So they're going to catch up entirely with the other group. So what I would have exploited if this was the case would be the gap between the treated and the control group in the years where one of the two is naturalized and the other one is not. However, in my setting, you can imagine that there's not going to be full compliance. There might be administrative delay, and actually it's estimated that there's a 1-year administrative delay from the moment you apply to the moment you obtain the nationality. So what you see in the raw data is not as clean as what I was showing before, but rather something that looks more like this. This is going to be an extremely fuzzy design. And what's going to be important for my identification is just that there's a gap in naturalization rates between what I'm calling the treated and the control group. So here what I'm showing you is the proportion of people that are naturalized in each year since marriage. So in T0, 1, and 2, there does not seem to be a real gap going on, and I'm going to come back to this in the first stage analysis with the standard errors and everything. And what seems to happen is that as from the 3rd year of marriage, there seems to be an increase in the number of, in the proportion of naturalized in the treated group. This jump here is all, the equivalent for the control group is something in the 5th year. So this is mechanical as what we would have expected, and gradually these two groups are going to join together at the end of the process. Of course, I do a series of checks to make sure that this is not driven by out-migration. So this is not, there's no differential probability of these groups out-migrating. And I also check whether the sample composition does not change over time and within these periods of marriage. So this seems to be really driven by the reform. So if, yeah.
I have two clarifying questions. So I think, so one is from Martin Fernandez Sanchez. So asking if I married in January 2004 and apply in August 2006 and I get naturalization, or no, am I get naturalization or I arrived too late?
If you're married in January 2004 and you want to apply in August 2006, you arrive too late. So the law that's going to apply to you is if you apply before the reform, you can still apply. If you wait too long, you're not going to be eligible. That might also explain why, I mean, if some people, for some reason, did not apply on time, they will also delay their naturalization is delayed. What's going to matter for my setting is just the fact that there's enough people that are naturalized in the treated group and enough people that are not naturalized in my control group. Is there another question?
Yeah, the other one is about the 1-year administrative delay. So how do you get to that point, basically?
Yeah, so this is the statistics published by the administration, the French administration. So they estimate that there's around 354 days between the date of application and the date they obtain the nationality.
Sounds good.
Great. So if there's no more questions about the design, let me now go to the data. So the data that I'm going to be using in this paper is a large-scale social demographic panel, the échantillon démographique permanent, that will allow me to follow individuals over time through different sources of information. So this is a very rich panel data that will allow me to look at the civil registry of marriage, from where I'm going to get information on the nationality at marriage and the date of those marriages. So this will allow me to identify the type of marriage, whether these are foreigners married to French, foreigners married to foreigners, for instance, and I'm going to be identifying whether they are in the treated cohort or in the control cohort. The population census data is not going to give me any information on the channel for which they apply for their nationality. It's not going to give me any information on the date of naturalization. However, it gives me the nationality of this individual at different points in time. So matching these two information will allow me to have a proxy for naturalization, in the sense that if a person declared being foreigner at the time of their marriage and then later on as being French, I'm going to understand that they've been naturalized at some point. Finally, I'm going to also use the part of the DADS for those who are used to the DADS panel data. In this, in the EDP, I only have the employee side of the panel data. So I will only be able to identify data on their wages, the contracts, the number of hours worked, and so on and so forth. And this will allow me to get the labor market outcomes. Yeah, so this is in terms of the data that I use. Of course, this is a very rich panel, but given that I'm looking at very specific individuals married at specific times, this is going to shrink my sample sizes a lot. So in the first stage analysis, what I'm going to do is to test whether the reform has had an effect on naturalization rates. So to do so, I'm going to match the marriage registry to the population census, and the specification is going to be a simple difference in difference strategy, with on the left-hand side, the nationality of individual I at time t, which I will regress on t, which is a dummy for being in the treated cohort, post, which is a dummy for whether you are before or after 4 years of marriage, and and lambda, which is going to be the interactions between the two. What you need to notice here is that I'm showing you the static form of this estimation. In the results, I'm also going to show you the results in terms of the dynamic results, and the specification is exactly the same. Instead of a dummy for post being before or after, I'll have a dummy for every year since marriage. In the reduced form analysis, I won't be able to do a second step instrumentalizing because of the structure of the different sources of data. What I will be able to do is to do a reduced form analysis, so to estimate the effect of naturalization on the labor market outcomes. To do so, I'm going to match the marriage registry with the employee panel data, and the spec is very similar to the one in the first stage analysis, with YIT being the labor market outcomes. And I'm going to regress that on the post as before, and the interaction between post and treat is going to give me the labor market difference between the treated and control group before and after they are naturalized, before and after what I believe is the time they're going to be naturalized. And I also include individual fixed effect in this setting. The standard errors are going to be clustered at the individual level. So the last step in the empirical setting is the fact that you might have understood that I'm looking at cohort analysis. So I'm comparing two cohorts of people in a difference in difference approach. And this might simply pick up the effect of economic cycles. So to account for economic cycles and year effects, and to reduce any potential bias that might be driven by the fact that there's just a year effect that's kicking in, I will adopt a triple difference approach. So I will identify a third group that is, according to me, the comparable group that is not going to be affected by naturalization, by the reform. So this group is going to be foreigners married to foreigners. Of course, they are slightly different than foreigners married to French, but I'll be using matching approach to make sure that I match on the observable characteristics to make sure that they look very similar. And these people were not affected by the reform because they were not eligible, simply because they were not eligible to apply for the naturalization through marriage. So using this group, I'm going to have do a triple difference with matching. The specification is similar to the difference in difference, where here I also add a third interaction, which is mixed. Mixed is a dummy that takes value 1 if these are foreigners married to French, and 0 if these are foreigners married to foreigners. Here again, there are individual figures, and the standard errors are going to be clustered at the individual level. So to go to the descriptive statistics, so what you need to see here is basically that the group of foreigners married to French is slightly different than the group of foreigners married to foreigners. They tend to be slightly younger at their marriage, less age difference when they're getting married. They tend to be, there is a lower share of women. This is simply reflects the fact that there are more foreigners married to French. There are more foreign men married to French women than foreign women married to French men. That simply is explained by that. There are a little bit more francophone. That I guess also is not so surprising, as I was saying before. And on the labor market outcomes, they tend to be slightly with a slightly higher earnings, with a lower number of hours worked, but higher hourly wages. So in my balance test, what I'm going to do is test whether in the pre-treatment period, whether they are different. And what I see is that the difference of the differences does not seem to be significant in the baseline. So to show you the first step, this is the first stage analysis. It reflects the graph that I showed you before. Here I'm showing you the difference in the proportion of naturalized as the proxy that I constructed. And what I see is that in the first 3 periods, none of the 2 groups are supposed to be eligible through naturalization through marriage. What you see is that there does not seem to be a significant difference between the 2. It starts kicking in as from the 3rd year slightly, but more so as from the 4th year. This might just be the administrative delay of 1 year. And what you see is that there's a gap, sizable gap between the treated and the control group that seems to be reducing, and this reduction towards the end of the period is mechanical by the fact that the control group are also going to become eligible for the nationality. I do a series of tests. Let me show you one of them. This is the same exercise for the never treated group, so for foreigners married to foreigners. And what I show here is that the difference in the naturalization rates is not significant throughout the whole period. All these coefficients taken together are not different from 0. I also do other placebo checks to see whether this is really driven by the reform. The first panel here is actually the actual dates, and all the other are just taking a random date and trying to find if I have an effect. And clearly this is only driven by the actual date. So having shown you the first stage, in the second stage, so in the reduced form analysis, here it's just an event graph showing you the trend in the labor market outcomes of the treated and the control group from the year of marriage to 10 years after marriage. So what you see is that there seems to be a parallel trend in the first 3 years since marriage, and a gap is introduced as from the 4th, 5th year, and 6th year of marriage. So the other one seems to catch up afterwards. If you look at the same graph for the never treated group, so the group that I'm going to use as in my triple difference analysis, there does not seem to be a significant difference between the 2 in any of the periods. So this will also explain why, when I do the triple difference analysis, the point estimates are not going to change. So before showing you the table with all of the results, let me first show you the dynamic results for at least the annual earnings. So here, in terms of annual earnings, what you see is that there seems to be a parallel trend before. This reflects the graph that I showed you before. And the difference in earnings starts kicking in as from T45 onwards. So this is in terms of the difference in difference. If I show you the table, this summarizes the main results of this paper. In the first panel, you have the difference in difference estimates, and in the second panel, you have the triple difference estimates. If you look at the difference in difference estimates, what you see is that naturalization seems to increase net annual earnings by around 2,000 euros, which corresponds to around 25% increase in earnings. This seems to be driven by an increase in the number of hours worked. And even if here the log hourly wages does not seem to be significant, if you look at the dynamic graph, clearly there seems to be an upward trend due to naturalization that's not captured because of the sample sizes. I do the same analysis as I was saying before in terms of a triple difference. And what you see is that, I mean, I lose in terms of precision, but the point estimate seems to be very close to the one of the difference in difference, which tends to convince us that there seems to be an effect in any case. So here, if you look at the dynamic effects in terms of the triple difference, you see that there seems to be an increase. So this is in terms of the general and the main results. As I was saying before, some of the mechanisms that are put in forward in this literature is the fact that it allows individuals to have unrestricted access to the labor market. So if you imagine the public sector, that tends to be restricted or conditional on the nationality in many countries. This is the channel that I test in column 7. So here I'm looking at whether obtaining the nationality increases your probability of being employed in the public sector. It does not seem to be the case neither in the different diff and the triple diff. This might be driven by the fact that in France, either the effect is too small to be detectable with my sample sizes, or that this takes even longer, more time to manifest itself, or simply that these are people that are already joined the labor market, and to enter the public sector in France, you have to go, in most cases, through a national concours, so a national examination to join the public sector. So it's very costly beyond the fact that you need the nationality or not to obtain, to enter the public sector. So which brings me to the final points of this presentation. So in this paper, I also check in terms of gender to check whether there are different results or different effects based on whether they are men or women. Note that here my sample sizes for women is pretty small as well. But even though there are small sample sizes, there seems to be an increase in earnings that is true for both men and women. And the increase in the number of hours worked is also relevant for both, even though in absolute terms it's more for men. And there's a slight increase in hourly wages for men. Other heterogeneous analysis that I've performed shows that the younger population tends to gain relatively more, and as well as the bottom of the distribution, so the manual workers and the employees, tends to be the ones that gains the most. And finally, one of the channels that I would like to spend a few minutes is the signal for language proficiency, or simply a signal for integration. So what I do is to check whether there seems to be an increase, like whether you have a differential gain from naturalization, whether you're from a Francophone or non-Francophone country. So this is a third interaction term that says that to begin with, non-Francophone have a lower earning than Francophones, and naturalization seems to lead to a higher premium for non-Francophone foreigners. So in a sense, if you imagine a person, rather than showing a Moroccan nationality, shows a French nationality, versus someone from an Indian nationality, so showing a French nationality versus an Indian nationality, the one from the Indian nationality to begin with is going to gain way more. And this I cannot test formally, but my intuition would be that this is driven by new hires, so new hiring, in the sense that this is going to matter when you send a CV to a new employer. So the employer has your CV, the information on the CV is the person is French, irrespective of whether that person has an Indian name, and that would signal to the employer that the person is very well integrated, or at least has passed the level required to obtain the nationality. And this might not be the case for Francophone countries, given that they already know that these people speak French or have a good level in French. So this leads me to conclude that in this paper, I use a quasi-experimental design to estimate the causal effect of naturalization on labor market integration. And the effect that I find is that naturalization increases annual earnings by around 2,000 euros. This is about a 25% increase in earnings. That seems to be driven by an increase in number of hours worked and log hourly wages as well. And as I've showed you very quickly towards the end, is that naturalization seems to be more beneficial for the least integrated ones. This is very in line with what the literature suggests, and which leads me to conclude that naturalization is not only a reward for integration, but can also be a catalyst or boost for integration. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm really happy to take questions either now or by email to my email address. Thanks.
Yajna, thanks a lot for this talk. So I will give the floor to Chem and then to Morgan. They have some questions. So Chem, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hey, thank you for the presentation. One question that is that came up to my mind is that when you're married to French, it might even be with the EU national, but they give you a titre de séjour right away, and
Yeah.
you already have unrestricted access to the labor market. So in that sense, maybe, as you said, naturalization is more about signaling. But yeah, I mean, at least in terms of access to labor market, actually being naturalized or not, the moment you're married, you get access. So that's, I think, one thing that you need to think about. And now for the public one, another reason could be that, you know, you could be employed in public sector without being French.
Yeah.
Either it's as a contractual or not, but you could be. So maybe it's not a really it's not a restricted sector. It's not reserved to nationals, at least in France. That would be my, thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. I think both are very linked one to the other. So to answer both questions at the same time, it's true that when you're married to a French citizen, you obtain the visa that I was explaining before, so that allows you to stay and work in France, and which allows you employers to hire you cost. In that sense, the step of being married already gives them a relatively unrestricted access to the labor market compared to other foreigners. However, the next step that you were pointing towards is the fact that the public sector, for instance, or apart from the public sector, there are other jobs. I don't have the English translation, but if you have a tabac, for instance, in France, it's conditional on the nationality, and there are around 20% of the French labor market that is actually conditional on the nationality. So if you think of the public sector, which is the big bulk of that, in education, so in higher education, professors hired can be hired without having the nationality, but the vast majority of the public sector is actually depending on the nationality. If you want to work with a titulaire, so if you want to work in the permanent positions. So those ones do require the nationality. That's where naturalization might play a role. I'm not sure, the second point was in the same line, right?
No, I think you kind of answer both. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just normal for you not to get any effects for the public sector in France. It's just, there are too many things happening and it's not clear cut. So I think it's a normal thing. It's quite normal that you're not getting anything there.
Yeah. So
and everything.
Yeah, sure. The literature pushes a lot the idea of the fact that naturalization is going to give you unrestricted access to the labor market. That might be way more relevant for another group of foreigners, that is those who are not married to French citizens. The group that I'm looking at that are married to French citizens already has one step ahead. Where it could have mattered would have been the public sector, but I don't pick up any effect for all the reasons I've mentioned before.
Right, thanks, Yajna. Morgan, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you guys for your presentation. I have clarification question about the graph on the dynamic result you have shown before. If I'm right, your results in T9, T10 are no longer significant. So I was wondering how we should interpret this effect. Does it mean that the effect of naturalization disappears over time?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So this is the mechanical effect. So the fact that it's reducing and it's not significant in the last two periods is mechanical, given that the other group, the group that I call the control group, is also going to be naturalized. So as you see in the first stage, in the rate of naturalization seems to converge towards the end. If I go back to the first stage, you see that the other group are starting to be naturalized as well. This is simply what you see on the labor market outcomes. So the implication of this seems to point towards the direction that there is no gain there's no persistent gain if only that there is an effect of naturalization. So in the long run, whether you have gain before does not lead to a persistent gain in the long run.
So it's a 0-1 effect and not a cumulative effect over years being naturalized.
Yeah, that's it. That's what these results point to.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Martin, can you ask your question, please? So Martin Fernandez Sanchez.
Thank you so much, Jas. I think this is a matter of interpretation, right? You talk all the time about the effect of naturalization, but in this context, as far as I understood, what is happening is that some people who were about to apply and naturalize, they got their application delayed. So the treatment by itself is that you don't have access to the naturalization and you will have to wait. Right? So we can interpret everything that you have shown not as the effect of naturalization, but the penalty of having to wait 2 more years to get a naturalization. And if one thinks about this in that fashion, to me, it seems that this reform may affect your behavior in many different ways, right? So you had planned everything to apply and get naturalized, and out of the sudden you realize that you cannot make it. You have to wait at least 2 years. So maybe, you had thought of applying to a certain job that you cannot apply now. Perhaps you have decided that you would have had children and now you delay the time when you have children, right? So I think that the reform is a shock for these people that you consider as your treated group, right? So your counterfactual to me is affected in more dimensions than the timing of the naturalization per se. So I don't know if you have any evidence on this.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So what you're pointing towards is the fact that I almost take it as a symmetric effect. So the fact that one group is penalized, for me, I'm interpreting it in the other way, that the other group is actually benefiting from obtaining the nationality. So I think you raise good points here. What's nice about the setting is the fact that, so in the first few years right after, there's one group that has no, like for instance, you were suggesting towards the fact that they might change their behavior. They would have wanted to apply for the public sector just for the sake of the example, and now they don't have the nationality and they cannot apply for the public sector, right? So in that case, it's just the effect of not having the nationality. Your other points in terms of children or their behavior in general, I have checked in terms of children, does not seem to lead to any differences. And in terms of, I checked also on other demographic characteristics in terms of divorce rates. If anything, it's going to be the group that is treated, so the one that is now obtaining the nationality faster, that seems to change, or like that seems to separate more. What you were suggesting would be somehow true if it's the group that has to wait longer, now changing their behavior and divorcing faster. That does not seem to be the case. But yeah, so the implicit assumption is that the effect is symmetric. And I think it's a plausible and not a strong assumption in this setting.
All right, then Etienne, can you unmute Etienne Bache?
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
perfect, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering 2 things about the matching. The first one is that maybe I missed it, but did you take the country of origin or the region of origin in the variables to do the matching? And the second one is, did you try to do propensity score matching just to see if the results are the same?
Yeah, so I do take the countries of origin. It's probably I didn't spend time on that in the presentation. Yeah, I do match on labor market outcomes and basic demographic outcomes, such as like the age and gender and the country of origin as well. I have not really tried the propensity score matching. I'm not sure if I actually tried it, to be honest, but I can definitely try to see if that changes anything. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. Then I have a question from Sulin Shadasho.
Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question that is about sort of the unobservables behind the selection into treatment and control. So I wonder if the type of marriages changes before and after the reform, and whether that's also driven by some sort of substitution effect between the merit-based naturalization or the marriage-based naturalization. So if you basically say, okay, we have unobservables, we don't see much, I wonder whether people who would have gotten married for a quick naturalization now choose the other route, right? So choose the merit-based naturalization path, and whether that could impact your results. And then just a few more technical things. I think it would be nice to show whether this reform was really unanticipated. It seems to me quite quick to have it known in March and then be passed in July. I wonder if there were certain discussions or platforms of parties sort of raising this issue. And maybe you can just show raw numbers of naturalization rates by December 2005 and see whether this is substantially higher or lower than in other years. Look out for multiple hypothesis testing. Maybe you do that. You use quite a few labor market outcomes, so you might be capturing some spurious correlation. You've mentioned at the beginning that you look at out migration. I haven't seen that in your presentation, so maybe you can say something about people leaving your data set. And then I was also wondering if there's also a reform of the cost. So in some countries in the US and Switzerland and Germany, you have to pay a fee to be naturalized, sort of an application fee. And sometimes when they do reforms, they change the costs associated with it. So I wonder if there's anything cost related in this reform as well, outside of just the waiting period. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, those are really great questions. I'll try to answer to the maximum number I can. So let me start from the last one in terms of application fees. To my knowledge, there's no change in the application fee of applying, but I can double check that to be completely sure. But in my opinion, there's no cost changes. In terms of what you pointed out at the beginning. So basically, in a different project in collaboration with Marion Le Tuac, we look at the changes in marriages, in the composition of marriage around before and after the reform is announced and passed. So the changes in the composition is going to happen after the reform is passed, so the marriage's characteristics are going to change. However, since I'm looking at July 2004 and nothing really happens in July 2004, this is 2 years before the reform happens, what would be relevant is whether the marriage composition is changing before and after July 2004. I'm not sure if that was clear. What I do is I check, for instance, at the observable characteristics. Of course, I don't have, I will only be able to check observable characteristics. And you see that there does not, I mean, you can clearly see that after 2006, when the reform passes, there's a change in, there's a break in the series, while in this period, that's going to be the one that I focus on, there does not seem to be much going on. In terms of average age at marriage, there's a general increasing trend. That's also for French married to French, so I'm not so much worried about this. In terms of education, for instance, there does not seem to be anything happening in this period. So that leads me to believe that these groups are more or less similar and that there's no selection before and after July 2004, given that the reform happens in July 2006. Whether the reform was anticipated, so it's unanticipated in the sense that in 2004 it was unanticipated. Around 2006, so in March 2006, it might have been in the air, like people might have been discussing it. That's why I trim my, my control window to February 2006, and I also tried to trim a little bit more so that I imagine that before it was announced, it was also already discussed. I trim it even more and does not change the results. And to finish very quickly, in terms of out-migration, what I'm able to test is, so let me find it, is just to check whether, what's the probability of observing these people over time. So these are French married to French, and I mean, it might not be very informative to you, but just in general, it might not be very informative given the structure of the data. So you don't observe everyone every given year, you observe each individual every 5 years. So this is the probability of being in the census year by year for the treated and control for foreigners married to French versus French married to French. And you see that there does not seem to be a differential probability of observing them. I checked this in many different ways. There does not seem to be a difference. So that leads me to believe that there is no differential rates of out-migration in my sample. And given that their composition seems to remain the same over time, this leads me to believe that even if there is out-migration, there's no selective out-migration. Yeah. Thanks for all your questions.
Okay, then I think we are done. I don't have any more raised hands or questions left, so I just give the floor to my colleague Alexia that will end up this seminar.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank
In
you.
case
Perfect.
anyone who has additional questions can also send me an email. Thanks all of you for your questions and participation.
All right. Yes, thank you also from our side. Thank you, Yajna, for this extremely interesting presentation, and to all participants for your comments and questions, to keeping the seminar very active. We look forward to our next session, which is going to be next Monday on the 2nd of November. And we will welcome Ole Hammer from Uppsala University, who will talk about the cultural assimilation of individualism and preferences for redistribution. Furthermore, we welcome new submissions and we review new submissions for the coming semester on a rolling basis. So please feel free to send your paper to our email address, and and just check out our website for the scheduled submissions or to watch the videos. And just to remind you, probably now you're used to our new format. We're having seminars now weekly, Mondays from 5:30 to 6:20, and we will have, or we have, one presentation rather than two. Okay, thank you all very much and have a wonderful week.